Globalization put to the test as the coronavirus spreads. Many argue there is an absence of global leadership in the fight against the pandemic. So is that justified? And can countries deal with the threat of corona alone? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. Now, it's being called a war against an invisible enemy, and it's now being fought on a global scale. The world is in a race to stem the increasing number of coronavirus cases. As many as 60,000 new infections are being reported every day, and governments and healthcare systems are struggling to keep up. Even among the richest nations, the spread is spiralling out of control. Restrictions on people's movements and mandatory quarantines are in place across much of the world, measures that many experts say have come too late. As the number of sick and dying rises, governments are scrambling to get the resources required for the fight and to rescue free-falling economies. But world leaders are being accused of putting their own country's interests and their own political survival ahead of the global good. Leaders of the 20 biggest economies held a virtual conference pledging $5 trillion, but that exposed some differences. The US has taken a leading role in past pandemics such as Ebola, but was slow to even acknowledge this crisis. President Donald Trump has repeatedly referred to it as the China virus, a term seen by many as casual racism that's further strained relations with Beijing. China says the virus is past its peak and is sending health workers and aid to affected countries. But it's been criticised over reports officials covered up the initial outbreak. The EU has failed to form a united response. In an online meeting, the leaders of the two worst affected countries, Italy and Spain, argued with other members. And border disagreements have been criticised by the President of the European Commission.
When Europe really needed to be there for each other, too many initially looked out for themselves. When Europe really needed an all-for-one spirit, too many initially gave an only for me response. And when Europe really needed to prove that this is not only a fair weather union, too many initially refused to share their umbrella. But it was not long before some felt the consequences of their own uncoordinated action.
There we are. Here we go. Let's bring in our guests today. Joining us from Stockholm on Skype, we have Bildt, a former Prime Minister of Sweden and the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. In Seattle, we have Sarah El-Tantawi. She's an incoming professor of modern Islam at the Fordham University. And in Washington, we have Melinda Liu. She's the Beijing bureau chief at Newsweek magazine. Welcome to you all. Bildt, can I come to you first? Which president or prime minister got it wrong, and which president or prime minister has got it right?
I think the historians will have to debate that. It is fairly obvious that a number of people got it wrong. I mean, the Chinese authorities clearly reacted too late or even tried to suppress the information on what's going on, and that had a very detrimental effect. I think it's fairly obvious that President Trump was fairly late to put it rather diplomatically in recognizing what was happening. And as you indicated earlier, in Europe, I think there was an understanding that things were happening primarily in Italy. But there was an initial attempt to seek only national solutions to the detriment of the single market of the European Union. So there's a lot of learning to be done. And then I think global coordination has been exceedingly weak so far, at least.
Sarah El-Tantawi in Seattle. Can you name us a leader who changed tack, who changed direction quite dramatically because they started listening to the scientists instead of listening to their political advisors?
I can't exactly name a leader who has done that. I think what President Trump is doing is modulating his message based on the fact that he is realizing that the American public is listening to the scientists more or less and not as interested in the usual political back and forth. So ironically, from a political point of view, he is modulating somewhat based on the scientists. There was just a report that came out that ranks the top 2 most trusted politicians in the United States right now on this issue are Anthony Fauci and Andrew Cuomo, and the bottom 2 are President Trump and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. So that is the kind of data that really motivates the president to step back to the degree that he is able to do so and give the scientists more leeway than he probably otherwise would be inclined to do.
Melinda, to you in Washington, when you were looking in on what was happening in Europe, what was your reaction to that? Because, for example, if we deal with, say, specifically Spain, Spain clearly saw what had happened in China, what had happened in Iran, and yet on the 9th of February, the Spanish government said, oh, it's okay, it'll be a handful of cases. Fast forward by 6 weeks, the same government spokesman is talking about hundreds of deaths.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm trapped in a recurring nightmare because actually I'm a Beijing-based correspondent. I live and work in Beijing. I had been in Beijing in February and undergoing quarantine there, but then I had to come to the States for an important event that I was supposed to take part in. So I thought, oh, I'll be smart and come early. So I came to Washington, D.C. and underwent a second quarantine in D.C., self-administered, only to emerge into a world where everyone was going into quarantine. And so it just so happened that my own cycle, it's been like Contagion meets Groundhog Day, if you want to use a cinematic analogy. It's remarkable how the world, individual countries have watched other countries go through this, and they're having a sort of a state of denial, saying, oh, look at how tragic that is, and not taking on that it could happen there. So now I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm seeing some of the exact same reactions, indeed some of the exact same missteps happening here that I had seen happening in Beijing 6 weeks ago.
Does that mean, Melinda, when you were in Beijing 6 weeks ago, was it about saving lives, or was it about social stability? Was that a representation of primacy for Xi Jinping?
When I was in Beijing under quarantine, the government was trying to do 2 things at once, and they were mutually exclusive things. One was stop the virus, very draconian containment strategy, mitigation. The second was let's get the economy going again because people have jobs, they need to eat. Now, today, this is the exact same challenge confronting U.S. President Donald Trump, and in his case, he's trying to do all of them. One day he'll come up and say, this is nothing, we'll be over with it very quickly, it doesn't kill that many people, it's just like the flu, people die in traffic accidents all day, so we're not going to ban people from making cars or driving on the street. So just stick with us. We're doing a great job and we'll get over it. A couple of days, then he was much more somber. And then maybe the next day he would flip-flop back again. I've rarely seen such high-level policy flip-flopping taking place on live TV in my journalistic career. It's rather riveting, but also terrifying.
Carl Bildt in Stockholm, if we look again at the European aspect of this, and we kind of drill down into that flip-flopping or delivering a policy, I mean, Spain was, at the leading edge of not doing it wrongly, but not doing it as well as it possibly could do. I mean, Mr. Sanchez, the Prime Minister, started talking about bringing in some emergency powers, but he said, okay, you've got 24 hours before it happens. So people dispersed. They took the infection to other places because they had 24 hours to get to where they wanted to get to.
And I think similar things happened in Italy, which was who has been by far the worst hit in Europe so far. When they very early went for, that has to be said, they went very early to quarantine, I think 40 or 50,000 people in what was then the original red zone. But part of the information on what they were planning to do thereafter leaked out. For example, when they was closing down Milan, that leaked out some hours before, and quite a number of people left Milan and went to southern Italy. That being said, it is primarily northern Italy still is happening. Everyone is struggling with the issue. No one has been particularly perfect. They are learning on the job, mildly speaking. But I think at least in the European countries, there is a recognition that it is something serious. There's not been an attempt by any serious politician to say that this is nothing or invented by political opponents or blaming others for it, as we've seen, for example, elements of in the debate in the United States. But then Europe and the EU is a unique bird in the sense that responsibility for national health issues is not an EU responsibility. That's a national responsibility. But the EU has a responsibility for the single market, keeping the borders open for the free flow of goods, medicines and equipment and things like that. And that's been struggling somewhat. I mean, there was an element of closing down borders in the beginning for medical equipment. That has now been lifted because everyone, I think, understands that no one can do it alone. No one can supply all of their needs alone. We need to do this together.
Okay, very, very briefly though, Carl Bildt, because I do want to move on to the US and also other big issues. Post-Brexit, for Boris Johnson, who's now just in the past couple of hours been confirmed as having it, although he's got it in a mild way. Post-Brexit, the first move away from regulatory divergence has been a complete failure for 10 Downing Street.
Well, it's been rather strange because, I mean, from the EU point of view, we are still in the sort of a transition period. So the EU treats Great Britain or the United Kingdom as part of the EU for all of the measures. But then the UK itself evidently missed some deadline to report to be part of the joint procurement of medical equipment, which was regrettable. But from the Brussels point of view, the UK is still treated as part of the single market, for example. But
okay.
That has not been fully recognized in London, evidently.
Okay, Sarah in Seattle, let's talk more about Donald Trump. January the 22nd, that's his first recorded comment on the coronavirus. He says, quote, "We have it under control." It had already spread to 4 other countries by that point, and all the planes were still flying, all the cruise ships were still cruising.
I think what we're seeing now, there's a lot of focus, of course, on President Trump really failing to grapple with how serious of a situation this is. I think if we can step back, what we're really seeing now is really a conversation between 2 factions that really see the role of the state in fundamentally different ways. President Trump seems to be representing a faction that really sees the state as an organizing body for the economy and for business. And at best, that camp would think that if conditions are ripe and sort of as healthy as possible for business and the economy, then this will filter down and help the citizens. There's another faction that actually understands the state in a deeper and broader way as an organizing body that administers care and relief to citizens and that understands us as a community that wants to help each other and engage in some form of mutual care, no matter what the cost. And so I think that is the deeper kind of fault line that's being exposed right now. And President Trump, he still refuses to enact the Production Act that he has the power to enact, which would order businesses to produce protective equipment and ventilators and other critical medical supplies. We have 3 governors who are now begging President Trump to invoke this. The governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, Jennifer Granholm of Michigan, and Jay Inslee here in Washington State. At this point, President Trump absolutely refuses to do this. And in fact, just yesterday went on television and really insulted those 3 Democratic governors. So unfortunately, the situation at the federal level is not improving if you believe the governors when they tell of the most hard-hit states in the country, when they tell President Trump what they need.
Melinda in Washington, has the time now come when we need to hear more from the scientists and the specialists and the doctors and hear less from the presidents and the prime ministers?
Absolutely. I find it astounding that in the United States, there's there's a big debate between politicians and business people versus scientists. I mean, this is a pandemic. This is a war, but it's a war that's being waged in the medicine and science field. You need experts in medicine and science in order to help shape the strategy. Having said that, it's very easy to criticize things that have happened up to now, everywhere, in every country. I can't honestly think of any single entity that's handled this really, really well, that has no reason to have any regrets, except possibly some very small entities. And let's face it, scale matters in this case. That's why some of the bigger countries are having, even some developed countries are having problems. Singapore has come in for praise in the way that it had handled it, but that's the size of a medium-sized city in China. So it's hard to compare apples and oranges in terms of scale. This is an unpredictable, terrifying, wild roller coaster ride where we haven't reached the end yet. So we can't say who's done it well, who's done it not well, who's moved perfectly and who hasn't. However, one thing we can say, one thing is very, very clear. The way we saw China operate and the way we see some Western countries operate, there's a fundamental difference in the perceptions and the expectations. In the case of China, it was how much can individuals sacrifice for the greater good of the community, the larger society, and the nation. And they've had some very draconian measures, some of which probably could not be implemented in the West. In the West, it's the flip side. The question is, how much will individual freedoms, livelihoods, meaning individual citizens, jobs and businesses, how much will that prevail at the same time creating great risks for the greater community, the greater society, the nation as a whole?
Okay. Carl Bildt, I just want to move on, Melinda, back to Carl Bildt in Stockholm. Carl, are we saying here that whether it's Washington, Donald Trump, London, Boris Johnson, Mr. Sanchez in Spain, or Xi Jinping in Beijing, there is a natural political knee-jerk instinct to either edit or cancel out or at least manage what the science and the scientists say, but the consequences of that could be appalling for the rest of us?
That was according to what we know. Clearly the case in China at the beginning of this. We know the stories of the brave doctors in Wuhan who tried to sound the alarm, and they were called into the police and said that they were spreading rumors that was sort of creating unrest. And one of them even sacrificed his own life in that particular struggle. I mean, it's fairly obvious. When I listen to scientists, they tell me that China closed down, really, or closed down Wuhan, to be precise. 3 weeks earlier, they would have got rid of 95% of it, and we might not have been in the situation where we are. So there has been a political element. That's more difficult to do in an open and democratic society. You can't close down freedom of speech, or you can't prevent doctors to go to the media and say what they think. So here, clearly, there is a difference. And then sometimes political leaders are sometimes somewhat reluctant to face the grim reality and hope that it just goes away. I mean, that was also the Trump reaction, fairly obviously.
Okay, Sarah in Seattle. Seriously, why doesn't the Trump administration just give the whole thing to Anthony Fauci? You've got a man who's done the same job since 1968. He's advised 6 presidents on HIV/AIDS/infectious diseases, and he's written the 7 definitive books on infectious diseases. The guy knows what he's doing, and apparently he's being managed by somebody someplace in Washington to keep his message slightly off the radar.
Yeah, he's remarkable, and of course that would be the right thing to do. I will say that politics are inescapable, as we all know, and one thing that does need to happen, I would love for Anthony Fauci to be in charge of the entire operation. We see with politicians who are so skilled, he has very, very nuanced political instincts, as does Andrew Cuomo. And we see how those two in particular have to kind of massage and finesse essentially President Trump's ego to even remain on the stage. I mean, people are terrified here that at some point Anthony Fauci will be fired or removed altogether. So we want to avoid that scenario. I will say that there is a place for politics in the sense that as a fellow academic, I greatly respect Anthony Fauci and the scientists' unwillingness to say anything definitive about medicines, cures, how long this is going to take. I understand that they are data-driven, they're careful, and they don't want to make those types of statements. At the same time, you have an extremely worried public, and you do have the realities of the economy that we do need to continue. So there is a role for smart politics here. And it seems to me that there needs to be someone who can listen to the scientists, but who can craft a political message that will give some shape, some direction for the American people. For example, someone says, listen, you're going to have to stay in your homes in quarantine for 8 weeks. That is a long time. That's going to be difficult. Please do it, and then it will be over.
We are heading towards the end of the programme. So briefly, Melinda, whether it's your professional stomping ground, the corridors of power in Beijing, or where you are right now in Washington, all three of you are saying the same thing, Melinda. The world needs clear messages, point number one, and guidance. What has to change so that we get that?
Each individual leader has to have that moment of epiphany, the light bulb going on and saying, oh my God, this is really very, very serious. What concerns me is that the path of least resistance is something very dark, which we haven't mentioned yet, which is xenophobia. In both China and America, the populations can unite when they perceive very clearly an enemy. Wartime brings enemies, but in this case, it's an enemy you can't see, you don't know where it is, you don't know who has it, who is it. And unfortunately, it's easy for, say, Donald Trump to talk about the Chinese virus and to blame China for everything that's happened. Of course, China made many missteps. The Chinese government made many missteps, and we've talked about some of them on this session. But it's also easy for China now, in its current situation now, sending its diplomats over all the world saying, we can rescue the rest of the world because we've come through it on the other end. And we already see that. They've been sending all kinds of medical supplies to Europe. They've just offered assistance to Trump.
Okay, Melinda, I'm going to pause you there, for which I apologise. Last word to Carl Bildt, because he's been sitting patiently in Stockholm. So, Carl Bildt, we need transparency, we need trust, collaboration, accountability as well. But who's going to hold these people to account? Who's going to say, not do a blame game, but who and when will somebody say, you got this wrong and here's why?
I think reality is dawning upon them. And I hope that reality is dawning upon them that this is not just the one nation or the other nation. This is a global phenomenon that requires global cooperation. The blame game could be relevant from the scientific point of view, but it's not relevant from the political point of view. And we've been discussing China, the US, and Europe. I fear what's going to happen in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, when it hits really vulnerable, Nigeria, Mexico. When it hits really countries with fairly fragile, in some cases, political and economic systems, and with virtually no health system whatsoever to cope with it. And that is going to affect us also. We need to help there, because otherwise it's going to bounce back to us somewhat later. So an increased recognition also of the global challenge, I think that is urgently called for.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you to our guests. They were Carl Bildt, Sarah El-Tantawi and Melinda Yu. And thank you to you too for your company. You can see the show again on the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, do check out our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet me. I'm @PeterDobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and everyone on the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.